Hello and welcome to this episode of the Geoeconomic Agenda, a podcast from the Institute of Geoeconomics at the Asia-Pacific Initiative in Tokyo that investigates the connections between economics, politics, business, and society. I'm your host, Paul Nadeau, and I'm a visiting researcher here at the IOG. Today we're sitting down with Hayley Channer. She's the Director of Economic Security at the U.S. Studies Center at the University of Sydney. And she's currently working on a project about Australia-Japan cooperation that is funded by the Australia-Japan Foundation. So, Hayley, thanks so much for joining us today.
Paul, thank you for having me. It's great to chat.
So, I'll start with the one thing that's on everyone's mind. How's Australia dealing with Trump?
Yes, well, as I work for the United States Studies Center, I get stopped and asked by many people about this. Obviously, President Trump is a totally different president to what we have experienced previously. I would say he's even quite different from his first term. The Australian government is doing a very good job, I would say, of managing the relationship very carefully. And what we have to remember too is Donald Trump has only been in the role now 4.5 months. Feels a bit like 4.5 years.
Keep that in mind. Yeah. Feels longer than that.
Yes, I mean the number of executive orders, the different deals he is trying to strike, and of course his tariff policy. For Australia, the biggest concern under a Trump presidency is his tariff policy because Australia is a free trading nation. We depend on our exports for our economic security. And although Australia has a large trade deficit with the US, we are buying a lot more US goods than we're selling to them. That didn't exempt us from the tariff. So we are still getting the 10% tariff and also the now 50% tariff on steel and aluminium. Mm-hmm. And it's not just the tariffs that are a concern. It's the fact that there is no longer strategy attached to the tariffs. So for a good tariff policy to work, Paul, I think a lot of economists understand that it needs to be a very long-term policy, longer than a 4-year presidential term. It needs to be stable so that the figure remains the same. And a lot of the time you need to have domestic population buy-in. And President Trump was elected on the premise that he would bring prices down. The tariffs are going to increase prices, so he has no public appetite for these increased prices. And so that instability is really concerning for Australia. And our government is trying to do anything it can, like striking deals with President Trump, including on critical minerals. And we're hoping that, within the next 6 to 12 months, there'll be some sort of stability out of the administration and a settling point for at least tariffs.
So you talk about deals, and I'm wondering what kind of deal is achievable? Because the good news and the bad news to me, sitting on the outside, is Australia didn't get hit with the quote-unquote reciprocal tariffs, the April 2nd tariffs. So a lot of countries have been using that as the basis of negotiations. That's the good news, that you didn't get hit with those IEEPA April 2nd tariffs. The bad news is that the tariffs that you got hit with, the 10% floor, seems to be a floor. It seems to be the lowest that the Trump administration is willing to go. And the steel and aluminum tariffs, Section 232 tariffs, do not seem to be negotiable either. So if you're Australia, if you're in Canberra, where do you start trying to negotiate a deal?
Yeah, great question. So our government has really started with what Australia's strengths are, and we've identified that President Trump likes critical minerals and rare earth elements. And so our government is trying to do some sort of draft accord with President Trump. Our ambassador to the US, Kevin Rudd, he was in a conference in Detroit last month talking about this draft accord. So I think our government recognises that President Trump likes announcements and deals. And if we can basically help get US investment into Australian domestic processing of our minerals, we can value add to those minerals and then export them to US companies. And we're imagining that President Trump, he's not interested in critical minerals and rare earths for the things that the Biden administration was interested in them for, like clean energy. He's probably more interested in the defence applications and advanced technology. So our government is trying to strike a deal. The other part too, Paul, though, is we don't sell a lot to the US. I think we sell about, maybe it's 4% of our total exports go to the US.
Just 4%.
Yeah, in volume terms, I mean, that explains the massive trade deficit. We are not selling them a lot. We are buying a lot. And if you think about the Australian economy, more than half of Australia's exports are minerals. So I'm talking iron ore, coal, gas. That's more than half of Australia's exports. The other part, about a third to a quarter of our exports, is international education, like university education, meaning international students coming to Australia, mostly Chinese students, actually.
Interesting.
So we don't have a big vulnerability in the tariffs because we're not selling a lot to the US. So it's concerning to us less so because of how it directly affects us, more so about how US-China, a trade war between those two countries could erupt, because a third of our trade, our two-way trade, is with China. So if the Chinese economy takes a hit because of the trade war, they will stop buying so much iron ore and coal from us, and the Australian economy will really suffer.
So that kind of puts Australia in a tough place, a little bit similar to Japan. I do think Japan feels very exposed given the auto tariffs, given the reciprocal tariffs they're facing. But, one place where I think Japan and Australia have a lot in common is sort of feeling squeezed between two competing economies that, I don't know how you want to frame it exactly. They seem determined to duke it out with one another. How's Australia positioning itself in that? You said Australia isn't quite as vulnerable directly, but they could be vulnerable due to certain knock-on effects. So from the perspective of economic security, again, if you're in Canberra, how do you try to, secure Australia's interests in that context?
Yeah, it's a great question. And every senior member of our government is asking themselves exactly that question right now. There are a few different dynamics happening that Australia would rather not see. And the truth is that for the last sort of 3 to 4 decades, we've had this unbelievable period of economic growth. We weathered the global economic crisis in the late 2000s. We actually sort of came out the other end of COVID reasonably unscathed. And sort of Australia's had this remarkable ability to bounce back a lot. And I know I've been talking about our exports being iron ore, coal and gas, and obviously we are trying to phase those out with the clean energy transition. But again, Australia is the lucky country because we have these massive reserves of critical minerals and rare earths. So that will be the next step. But in terms of like the global dynamics and the US-China competition, how it sort of impacts us, we're concerned about more broadly a breakdown in the global free trade order, which obviously Japan is as well. So if you take one example, for instance, Paul, you and I were talking before we started recording about the period of economic coercion that Australia faced by China. So between 2020 and 2024, China was really unhappy with Australia for a number of reasons. We banned so-called high-risk vendors, meaning China, China and other countries, probably Russia, North Korea, from bidding to provide Australia's 5G network, because we didn't want Chinese telecommunications companies within our system and having, requirements on them to share Australia's sensitive data with the Chinese Communist Party. There was that. Our government at the time during COVID called for an independent inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. That did not go down well at all in China. And there are a few other things that really put pressure on that relationship. So China stopped buying Australian coal, gas, wheat, barley, cotton, lobsters, table grapes, wine. There was a really long list of things, some luxury goods, some other goods. Importantly, it kept buying iron ore, so it really needed it. But Australia used the World Trade Organization and the dispute mechanisms available within the WTO to resolve its disputes with China. And most recently this year, in January, the very last item to continue to be traded with China, barley, finally went back onto ships to China because Australia used the WTO. So Australia really wants to see the international trading architecture strengthened and upheld, and that's not what's happening because the United States is not appointing appellate judges, and obviously China is using the WTO in ways that do not accord with the WTO mandate and values. And so I think Australia has a lot in common with Japan in the sense that Japan also needs free trade. And a lot of the time we are working with Japan in forums like the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, to make sure these rules are upheld, because without the rules, countries like Japan and Australia really suffer.
So that's kind of the $5 million question, though, because, you know, like you just said, the two biggest economies, United States and China, are not really being good players in the WTO system. And yet, as I always push back against people who say, oh, globalization is over, the international order is dead, I say, no. A lot of the world still wants, you know, a rules-based order.
Yeah, I would say the majority, right?
I don't, like, the Global South embassies that I talk to, well, their bias is always starting with WTO, with a rules-based kind of system. I mean, if you are in Washington, D.C., and if you don't get out much, then I could see why you say globalization is dead, because, you know, I think as far as Washington is concerned, it's not what it's going to look like before. But when you go to Tokyo, to Canberra, to, you know, take your pick of, you know, any capital outside of Beijing and Washington, there's still a lot of interest there. But can that kind of system survive without the world's two largest economies? I mean, I know I just sort of bracketed it by saying that, you know, everyone still wants this, but it still kind of matters that when the two biggest economies in the world are kind of, you know, funny about it. So is there a future for the WTO system, as I think, you know, Tokyo and Canberra and a lot of other places would agree?
Yeah, I mean, Paul, another great question. And I said before that, you know, Australians are asking themselves how to deal with US-China trade war. People around the world are asking themselves how to deal with a breakdown of the global trading system and what comes after that system. Because I can't imagine the next president after Donald Trump being really excited about the WTO or other international
100%.
architecture, right? So,
Totally agree.
Yeah, so when we had workshops between Australian and Japanese officials, private sector and academia, we were asking ourselves what comes next, and also how can Australia and Japan shape what comes next. One of the things we came up with was that Australia and Japan need to do a better job of communicating within these forums how useful they are and how they can still benefit the membership. Even if that means creating breakaway groupings from the WTO. I can't remember the acronym within the WTO, the sort of, is it multi-party dispute resolution system? But basically it's a breakaway from the main arbitration group because that system is broken.
It's ringing a bell, yes. Yeah, there was a lot of talk about it last year, I think. Anyway, yes, sorry, continue. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, basically it's splinter groups and kind of temporary measures that could become more permanent measures. But essentially it's about showing how you can still work within the system. And I think the big key to it is not recreating the system. Like, you could not recreate a lot of the groups that exist today. And I think we went through a period, sort of maybe the 90s, the 2000s, where there was this explosion of smaller groupings, whether it was in the economic space or in the security space, lots of minilaterals and trilaterals. One of the more interesting stats I like to tell people is Australia loves to join groups because we're a so-called middle power. We love to join groups. We created APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Organisation, back in the late 80s. And Australia is a member of sort of 25 different groups to do with foreign affairs, defence and economics, starting with the Five Eyes group at the end of World War II, being kind of bookended by AUKUS recently. But in between 2011 and 2021, of those sort of 25 groups Australia has joined, it joined 10 groups within that 10-year period. So there's kind of this explosion of minilaterals because the larger groups weren't working. Now I think, looking forward, like the rest of the 2020s, the 2030s, I'm assuming there'll be smaller groups again. If you look at one other, there's the Minerals Security Partnership. That's meant to be about critical minerals supply chains. That's established because China has this dominance over critical minerals. So you see new groups kind of pop up all the time to provide bespoke solutions to these challenges because the global international architecture is not delivering in the way that it used to. So yeah, what replaces it? I think it's a whole like hodgepodge of smaller groups that come together in an ad hoc way and that kind of dissolve once that problem is fixed. Australia's problem, and maybe for other countries too, like Japan, is once you're part of a group, it's really hard to leave it. So you get a lot of zombie groups.
Status quo bias is almost undefeated. But I'll give you a really open-ended question right now. I think I agree with the general parameters of what you're talking about. I think it makes sense. I can see it. Is it good?
I mean, it's better than the alternative, which is a complete breakdown.
Fair.
I mean,
Fair.
If there's no rules and countries are undercutting each other and stealing intellectual property, etc., the majority of countries that are relying on free trade and sort of efficiencies and the cheapest products, everybody's going to lose out. So it's not ideal, but it's better than the alternative.
That's a good question, good response. One thing related to this, it's an idea I kind of want to throw past you to see how this might work vis-a-vis Australia. Is when I talk to diplomats or just different embassies here, I ask them, worst case scenario, you don't get a deal, you can't export to the United States anymore. What are you going to do? And the response very often is, we'll find new markets. And on one level, I think that's a great answer. I think it makes a ton of sense. I think it would be good for everyone. But at the same time, there's a reason why those markets haven't quite been served yet. They're either rather poor, they don't quite have the trade infrastructure, either the literal infrastructure like the ports and the rail and the highways and all that. They don't have the bureaucratic infrastructure. I won't get too far down into the details, but they don't have the trade capacity to do these kinds of things. So one of the things that I'm, I've been trying to push out there a little bit is getting countries like Japan and presumably Australia as well to help invest in this kind of infrastructure, help build out trade capacity. What do you think?
When you're talking about infrastructure, are you talking about transport infrastructure, like you mentioned, ports and railways, a bit like
transport infrastructure, bureaucratic infrastructure, that kind of thing.
I don't
want
that
ASEAN is really good at.
Yeah, I don't want to make all of your listeners really depressed, Paul. But
Continue.
I think about how Australia, Japan, and the United States wanted to provide infrastructure alternatives to China's Belt and Road Infrastructure Initiative. Right. And a bit like what is happening now with other sort of critical minerals mines and other parts of infrastructure, what China's advantage is that it can do things quickly, cheaply, it can negotiate directly with those countries. But building infrastructure and doing other work in collaboration with other countries takes a lot of time, a lot of coordination. I mean, in Australia, there's one main agency responsible for overseas infrastructure, which is our Foreign Affairs and Trade. In the United States, there are about 7 or 8 different agencies responsible. And so coordination among the parties gets really difficult. So I would say that it is hard for Australia and Japan to do things in the same way that China does in terms of building infrastructure out to facilitate trade, which is what the BRI did pretty successfully. Even if some of that infrastructure in the Pacific Islands, for instance, is really poor quality and is deteriorating and needs to be rebuilt in some cases or significantly repaired. The other problem is, and I know Japan faces this challenge too, is domestic costs that are dominating bureaucrats. I mean, in Japan, just like in Australia, there is an ageing population. In Australia, there are some major expenses that we're looking at. Other than aged care and healthcare, we're also looking at a housing crisis. The cost of defence is significant. We're looking at things like the AUKUS submarine agreement that we need to pay for. And even servicing national debt in Australia, also in Japan, a big issue. So I'd say that domestic expenses are really capturing a lot of bureaucratic attention. And that beyond that, when you're looking at, regionally or globally about infrastructure to facilitate more trade, It's very difficult to do, Australia can't do it alone, so it's always looking for partners. Japan is a little bit different. Japan is very adept at building infrastructure in Southeast Asia, quality infrastructure, and has rivaled China in a number of locations. But China has still got that edge, because if you were a developing nation looking for roads, hospitals, schools, buildings, and you had a partner like China who promised to deliver it within your term of government, that would be very compelling.
Yeah, I regrettably agree on most of that. So let's turn back to Australia versus the US here. You talked a lot about critical minerals and about how Trump wants access to those critical minerals. So I guess I'll start with that is by asking, does Australia see, as a negotiating strategy, does it see the critical minerals trade as a point of leverage, as a carrot? How is it approaching? Are they, I guess this will build up to my second question. Would Australia offer to cut China off of that critical minerals trade if that's what Trump asks? How are the negotiators approaching this issue?
Yeah, Paul, you're asking all exactly the right questions. The answer is that it is extremely complicated, and critical minerals is my favorite economic security topic because it captures all of the most, wicked challenges around global supply chains, choke points, commercial viability, national security, clean energy technology. It is the crux of every kind of economic security challenge. In terms of how Australia is thinking about critical minerals and using them, we have abundant reserves of critical minerals, particularly lithium, cobalt, nickel, those types of things. The US is obviously looking for suppliers of critical minerals, but it wants to do a lot of the processing and manufacturing in the United States. And the challenge is Australia wants to do that in Australia. So for the longest time, we have a dig and ship model where we dig it up and we ship it out. Pretty much 100% of Australia's lithium is processed in China. And actually, there has been one highly successful partnership on critical minerals between Japan and an Australian company. And that example is the only one where a company has been able to commercially produce rare earths outside of China. So that's a partnership between the Japanese government and Lynas Rare Earths. Actually, the US government has also invested in Lynas via the US Defense Department. So there are Australian companies that are doing really incredible things. And just recently, the last couple of weeks, Lynas announced that it has been able to extract heavy rare earths, which is a subcategory of rare earths. And so now it can produce those, but it's one company compared to the whole of China. So just to give you an example too of what's required to have a successful partnership on critical minerals, the reason that Japan-Lynas partnership was so successful is because instead of the government of Japan just giving a lump sum, a grant or a loan to Lynas, it was more of a co-development partnership where over several years the government of Japan supported Lynas through technical expertise, different types of investment over periods of very low pricing in rare earths markets, other kind of troubleshooting, and basically a sort of long-term patient capital. And in Australia, we have a problem with attracting long-term patient capital into particular investments. So the Australian government has been trying a few different things. It's recently announced a strategic minerals reserve, which could act like a stockpile, but it still needs to scope that project or that proposal with industry. And then in terms of Australia's value proposition, it is trying to think of a way to replicate some of the success that it's had with Japan with other countries. So it wants US investment in Australian domestic processing. I think we all got really excited about the Inflation Reduction Act under President Biden because it was about investing in critical minerals that would go into the Fords and Teslas that would go into electric vehicle batteries. But I also know that those EV subsidies have stopped under President Trump. And so there's a lot of wondering about the relationship and how Australia will be able to sort of clinch its own deal with the United States. And we're looking at other countries too to do what Japan did and invest in Australian domestic processing, because there is not enough public funds. We desperately need the private sector to partner with us.
Interesting. So I guess final question. We're about a month out from the deadline to negotiate the April 2nd tariffs that were postponed. The 90-day deadline is coming up. Is Australia going to be one of the 90 countries to get a deal with the Trump administration?
I hope so. I mean, if you look at what Australia is offering, its main trump card is critical minerals. Trump's already done, in the last 4 months, he's done a deal with India. Actually, it didn't really go reported. It was underreported. There's sort of a strategic minerals recovery initiative with India. The more obvious agreement that was struck was with Ukraine. However, I cannot see how that deal will actually produce critical minerals for the US within the next 10 years.
That's a whole other topic.
Yeah, and so...
I agree. I'm skeptical as well, but yeah.
So I would say practically, in terms of functioning mines and a trustworthy partner, Australia's in a good position to strike a deal with President Trump within that period. And obviously, the US administration has made a commitment to, 200 deals or something? I don't know. The number keeps changing.
90 deals in 90... I mean, it was 90 deals in 90 days, but you're right.
Yeah. I have heard President Trump say that he's already done 200 deals because a deal is what he says it is, But my point is that because of the pressure the US administration has put on itself and the fact that Australia has put a deal on the table, I can see that we're in a very good position, but you just can never tell, really. I mean, that's why Australia is wanting to work so much more closely with Japan, is because we are seeing so many of the same challenges on energy, critical minerals, the rules-based order, even in terms of technology de-risking. So where Australia can't work with the US quickly or clearly, we're looking to countries like Japan to do cooperation in areas that's going to be for mutual benefit.
Okay, I think that's a good note to end on. So, Hayley Channer, Director of Economic Security at the U.S. Studies Center at the University of Sydney, thanks so much for joining us. And I guess we'll find out soon if Australia does get a deal. But in any case, it's certainly a space to watch. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Paul. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. This is the Geoeconomics Agenda with Paul Nadeau. The Silk Road is famous for spanning the Eurasian continent, connecting Europe and East Asia, and most everywhere in between to supply spices, precious gems and metals, and textiles like, obviously, silk. But it was also responsible for bringing house cats to China. Cats were originally first domesticated in what's now Turkey from wild cats around 10,000 years ago, probably to help farmers deal with rats, mice, and other pests. From there, they made their way to Europe around 3,000 years ago, where they seem to have supplanted weasels as the preferred pest hunter of choice in people's homes. And we now know that the Silk Road is how house cats got to China. The oldest known domestic cat in China lived during the Tang Dynasty in the central province of Shaanxi sometime between 706 and 883 CE. But according to a recent study published on bioRxiv and summarized in the Smithsonian Magazine, genetic testing has revealed that domestic cats arrived in China a little earlier, around 600 CE, and probably coming from what's now modern Kazakhstan instead of being domesticated independently in China. Merchants traveling from the west along the Silk Road likely gave them to Chinese elites as an exotic pet. Most trade along the Silk Road involved goods for elites. And they were treated as honored guests in their homes, not just because of their ability to take care of pests, but also for their, and I quote, mysterious behaviors. Cat owners will understand what that means. That's all for this episode, but stay tuned for more on the way. Until then, we want to talk about what you want to hear about, as well as take your questions for our show, so send us an email at geoeconomicagenda@ihj.global. Be sure to like, rate, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, tell your friends, and most of all, keep listening. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to the team at API for making this happen, and we'll talk to you next time.